Professor Shou, you talk about the change from a nonfiction writer to novel writing, and it was like gender reassignment. Could you tell us like the major adjustment that you need to make in the process?
Well, that's a question that really lies at the heart of the difference between novel and reportage of a factual nature. I spent my whole life writing books that were historical and factual. And it's a strange and I think somewhat frightening liberation to be freed of the facts. In other words, to create characters and narrative that say what you want to say, even when an actual person won't say that for you. So it was precisely that freedom that I think made me want to try to write fiction, because the more time I spent in China, the more I felt that there were issues that sort of divided the US and China and separated people in ways that it was very difficult to get to in journalism or history. And what I mean to say by that is there are things that can be said maybe through literature or through people's appreciation of music or their engagement with religion, psychology, that really finally, I think, say as much about why the US and China cannot get along and why China does what it does. It isn't that we haven't found the perfect policy. It's that there's some very complicated and sometimes contradictory forces at work, which almost defy anybody's easy analysis. So that's what sent me off on a 30-year odyssey into writing historical fiction.
Many parts of your novel are based on solid research, obviously, including life in Qinghai, in Beijing's areas, Hutong, Central Music Academy, and San Francisco, also like the restaurants and the laundromat. It may take many years accumulation, right?
A lot of the research that one does is just to live it. And I spent a lot of time in China, and my wife was Chinese. My children speak Chinese. My wife's parents still live in Beijing. So, we had friends that lived in the Hutongs, and I spent some time living there myself and just feeling that very sort of beehive-like attitude that these narrow little alleyways clustered with courtyard houses and little shops at the ends that created. And it was very unique. I think it's all gone now, or almost all gone. And then, of course, in 1981, just as China was opening up with the, reform and opening period of Deng Xiaoping, I noted that the Chinese Mountaineering Association was allowing mountain climbers to go and climb some peaks that had been closed for decades. So I thought, well, this looks interesting. So I got on one mountain climbing and trekking trip, and we ended up spending, over a month in Qinghai. And that's where I ran into the Goloks, the Guola Zizhiqu. And so I thought, well, let's run my character up there. That's a kind of really interesting, strange, out-of-the-way place. And it also just happens Qinghai is the headquarters for the reform through labor, re-education through labor camps, and all sorts of pieces of the Chinese gulag, the penal colony. So, I took those elements of experience that I had had in some measure and tried to weave it into the fabric of a good story.
There are quite a few Chinese characters, 中文翻译 in your novel. So for Chinese language users, it's not hard to understand. But like for American readers who are not so familiar with Chinese, what could they respond to that?
If you're trying to figure out the US and China riddle, how the US and China can and cannot relate to each other, one of the big challenges is the language. So I thought to try to merge these things together in some regard, at least would be a symbolic attempt to bring, the yin and yang together, the East and West, all of these contradictions. Chairman Mao loved contradictions. He wrote many, many quite interesting essays on contradictions. He saw the world as a contradiction. And indeed, the US and China are a contradiction. And it's exactly the nature of that contradiction that I wanted to try to better understand, since I've spent my whole life living it And, when I first went to China, initially I had to go to Taiwan to study Chinese because Americans couldn't go to China. And then I went in 1975 at last and spent several months working in a agricultural model brigade, the Dajia, Dadui, the agricultural brigade in Shaanxi province, and then in the Shanghai electrical machinery factory. And the thing that's just really completely bewildered me was you could not make friends with anybody. Now, why was that? I spoke Chinese. I thought I understood Chinese. I'd spent a lot of time with Chinese in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and America. And yet it was like oil and water, separate. Well, there were reasons. And so what were the reasons? The reasons were that the US and China had very different narratives about each other. And Mao saw the US and China as what he called an antagonistic contradiction. And it was not one that could be just solved by talking and peacefully. He saw it as one that probably had to be resolved by struggle and violence. And we're still there, this term, hostile foreign forces that the Chinese Communist Party uses to speak of that contradiction.
Luxun certainly plays an important role to you when approaching the big topic of China study. What are the reasons? It seems like his works are not as important as before in China. Many of his work have been out of textbook in China. What do you think about the possible reasons behind this move?
Well, Luxun was not a Paimapi, not a panderer to the Chinese Communist Party. He was a leftist, but he did not like what he saw of sort of Leninist party structure. And he really was one of the last writers who had a deep independence, a streak of independence. And he was someone who recognized that he was caught in between all kinds of things. He was caught in between left and right, between Confucian culture and modern culture of the West, between East and West, science and all sorts of superstition. He was a wonderfully ironic, funny, witty, biting person who just didn't fit in. But Mao Zedong happened to like him. So he acquired a status and he continued, where in actuality, I think his writing, from any Maoist perspective, deserved to be censored. So now he has been forgotten just because he reminds people like Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party that what an independent voice actually sounds like. And so I called my novel, My Old Home, Guxiang, the wonderful, wonderful Luxun's short story about returning home and years later as a successful writer and running into his peasant boyfriend as a boy and realizing the great class difference and the great gap that was between a very sad and beautiful story. So I felt that was a bit like what I wanted to speak of in the novel, was that in a certain sense, many Chinese are in exile. They left in 1949. Many are leaving Hong Kong now. I mean, there's a huge theme of being in exile, of not being able to be comfortable on either side. You can't be there and you can't be here. And that to me is part of the great tragedy of China, is that it makes people choose at the same time that the world is globalizing and people are becoming accustomed to living in several cultures or two cultures at once. We now find ourselves decoupling again.
The novel covers the time period from 1949 to 1989, quite depressing time for Chinese people, actually, especially like the Li family and his friends. They are intellectuals. They are called 臭老九 that time. And if your readers feel a little bit low when reading it, what could you say to them to make the reading experience very worthy?
Well, I guess I would say that in a certain sense, Chinese history does have a lot of tragedy in it. And that's one reason the Chinese Communist Party keeps trying to change history, rewrite history to make it look better than it was. I mean, the party caused immense suffering. It did some good things too, but it caused just, 30, 40 million people died in the Great Leap Forward, and then there was a Cultural Revolution. So what I have to say is that's the way it is. And it is sort of the tragedy of China that as it came to finally find its balance and undergo this period of remarkable economic growth, it went through an awful lot of self-inflicted agony and pain and damage. And you can't deny it. And the only thing I could do in writing fiction was to try to put a little bit of humor into it, because actually, I think, the Chinese have a wonderful sense of humor. It's one that they've developed as a survival mechanism, and it can't always be said in public, but there is a tremendously wry way of looking at the absurdity of much of what happened in the Chinese Communist Revolution, and the pomposity and the sort of grandiose, overweening, arrogance of the way leadership and leaders unrestrained sometimes act. So I tried to create some characters sort of like up in Qinghai, little autocrats who rule their tiny, insignificant world, just the way Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping rule the country.
In their relationship, literally as a rebel under Mao, he seeks stability and constancy. And for Juliet, the child of a capitalist society, ends with embracing the idea of great disorder under heaven. How do you get this kind of inspiration for the relationship part between Little Lee and his American girlfriend?
I think America for him, as for many Chinese, particularly in the 1980s, was this land of a different kind of liberation, of sort of freedom and spontaneity and individualism and excess too. So he goes to America and he ends up with this American dancer whose whole sort of idea is to sort of overthrow the establishment, whereas Little Lee is trying to find order and steadiness. Just having come out of the Cultural Revolution, she's sort of looking for individual fulfillment and a little bit reckless. So there's a clash there between his idealization of America, that expression in Chinese, 中国的月美国的月亮比中国的月亮圆. The moon in America is rounder than in China. I think a lot of Chinese, particularly in the 80s, had that idea. But when they came to America, of course, they realized America was a reality of its own. It was ambiguous too. It had pluses and minuses and strengths and weaknesses. And it was a very, I think, sometimes a difficult experience. And yet to go home was a difficult experience. So then where do they go? Which side do they belong on? It's not clear.
Reviewing your research on China over the past 60 years, what do you think about the current US-China relation?
I think it's surprising to me that, having spent my whole life, I started studying China in the 1950s when I was at Harvard, when you couldn't go there. And I didn't get to China for 20 years. I could go around the outside, enviously looking in. I used to be very envious of my Canadian friends who could go to China, but I couldn't. And I remember lying on the beach in Taipei, sort of between Taipei and Keelung, and listening to radio broadcasts. That was illegal, but we did it anyway on transistor radios coming in from China during the Cultural Revolution, and dreaming of going there. And then finally I did go there. And finally things did come together. And the 1980s was an amazing period of openness and hope and close interaction. And then we all know what happened in 89, but then things came back again under Jiang Zemin. But under Xi Jinping, we are completely tearing the fabric apart again. And I never thought I'd see that day, that we'd return to exactly the place where I began, where you couldn't go there, friends were disconnected, businesses had trouble, universities had to kind of disconnect, and all of the sort of interactions that we laboriously built up with foundations and NGOs and people to people and musical groups and you name it, they're all pulling apart now. And I don't think anyone has any idea how to stop it. And that to me is a kind of a bitter end, just as the end in my own book is quite bitter. The hero dies.